It's Buffalo's #1 music source. It's WDAP Radio.
Welcome to Pro Talk with the Mighty Oba. Today we have one of the most distinguished guests we have ever had. He is part of the longest legacy of black journalism in Western New York. My good friend, Brother Frank Merriweather III.
Patrick.
We have to distinguish that, the third,
Yes, sir.
because there are three
That's right.
Franks.
Yes,
and
yes.
a lot of people get them confused. Am I correct?
Pat, they do. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm glad to be in the house with the Oba.
We're going to have some fun while we're here. Hope everybody tunes in because a lot of times they don't get an opportunity to hear Frank really disseminate some of the history of black journalism in Western New York, and he has played a major part in that for several years. First, Frank, I wanted to ask you, how did the Merriweathers arrive here in Buffalo and Western New York?
Pat, Texas, Tuskegee, New York City, and to our humble abode here in Buffalo, New York, or their humble abode, Western New York. My grandparents were from the southern part of Texas, and actually went to Tuskegee University and did some traveling around the country. At least my granddad did. My grandmother was a school teacher in Texas. And ended up in New York City. My granddad, Frank Merriweather Sr.'s very good friend, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., was able to get him a job in the printing industry in the New York City area. Mm-hmm. He was there for a little bit. In fact, my grandmother was there for a little bit. Didn't necessarily like the environment per se for in New York for raising children. She goes back to Texas, and Granddad lands a job in Buffalo. And the rest is history, I guess, Pat, huh? And I guess I should clarify those dates. I would say maybe around 1920 ended up here in Buffalo. And then went into business and started the Buffalo Criterion Press, which was a printing outfit there. And they did what you call job work: tickets, posters, raffles, church bulletins,
invitations, things like it. Was that the basis of the relationship, the long relationship with the black church? Did it
Absolutely.
start from the printing business?
Yeah, because at that time you didn't have mimeograph machines, and so we did a lot of church programs, anniversaries, and that kind of thing. And so that was maybe our introduction into the black church. And then at that time, too, very small population in terms of the black community here. So it was pretty close-knit, I understand. And my grandfather had an interest in politics as well, and so...
now, he was a Republican.
He was a Republican at
that
time. Now,
people need to realize that back then...
That's right.
Most Africans that lived here in America were Republican if they were politically active.
That's right, based on Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, this is a term, Lincoln Republican.
Right.
Yeah, and so... he had a real do-for-self kind of attitude, which was instilled at Tuskegee in terms of dropping your bucket where you were and going to work. And prior to going into the printing business, he did a lot of other things. He was a tailor by trade, worked at a jewelry store, worked on the railroad. So he did a number of different ventures, per se, before landing here, and he did like Buffalo.
And your grandmother was Carmelita.
My grandmother's Carmelita Merriweather. As I said, she came in, was very active. In fact, they started a Republican club called the Booker T. Washington Republican Club. The Women's Auxiliary was the Martha Washington Republican Club. And they did a lot of things like voter registration, voter education, that kind of thing. You don't necessarily hear about voter education now. There's a lot of emphasis on registration and such, and I guess maybe that's the intro, per se, to politics. But after that, the education component.
Were you familiar with your grandparents? Did you get to meet them?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it was a funny thing. Especially, my grandmother. I actually saw my grandmother 5 days a week, 5 to 7 days a week.
Okay.
Yeah, she was a very integral part of our business. And, just as a youngster, I saw her do some very, very, very amazing things that at that time, in my youth, I hadn't seen any other woman in the newspaper business do. She covered stories, she sold ads, she was active in a lot of the clubs, but the business end, she was able to work, I use the term, in the front office and in the back office. The back office is where all the printing and all of the typesetting and all of that takes place. And so she just wasn't able to take news in or take an order in for a poster or a raffle ticket or a program. She was able to typeset that work and then put it on a press and give you a finished product.
So when did the Buffalo Criterion really start as a weekly newspaper? What
1925.
1925.
Yeah. Comes in at that time with the famous Michigan Avenue Y and the Urban League. Those organizations were about 2 years apart. We started in 23. I believe the Michigan Avenue Y, 1925, and the Urban League, which was known as the Chapel. I don't know whether, I guess it grew out. I don't specifically know the history of the Urban League, but I know they started in 1927. Yeah, so we're just a few years apart.
Now tell me, the early years of the Buffalo Criterion, how did they, how many were they putting out there? Was it?
Well, it was as I said, at that time, and, I just spoke to some young people not long ago, and I was saying, at that time, communities were always pushing for civil rights, and you had to have a means of communication. Now, no Skype, Pat.
Right.
No Facebook. You know what I'm saying? And oftentimes when we hear about the civil rights movement, not much is really said about the black press, but that was the means of communication that we had. It was the black press, the civil rights organization, and the church, because usually that was the venue in which we were able to get large amounts of folks in. So, but as I said, not much is said.
Was that the bulk of the distribution of the church?
Well,
yeah, the churches?
But also we had a partnership with the black civil rights organizations, because really at that time it was a concerted effort to forward the black community. And so you were using every means at your disposal at that point to do some of the work, because oftentimes you forget when you're looking to do that kind of work, man. It's a lot of heavy lifting. Everybody has a little part to play, in that. And the Black Press's role was to get that word out and really to distinguish your story from that of major media.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where that theme that you oftentimes put on the paper, we want to tell our own story.
Well, that and our theme for a number of years is educating and building, because that's the thing that you really want to do. You want to educate people as in terms of telling your story. I think that's just the most important kind of thing. Setting out your history so that, Pat, I like to take pictures. So
right. That's your thing.
But one of the reasons why I do that, because I say that if we look at something 10, 15, 20 years from now, what would be, we're not necessarily, we're able to do it now, but years ago you weren't able to resurrect the speech, but you could look at the picture.
Right.
And the story that's on there.
Absolutely.
And so all over the world, folks are looking for little tidbits of history. That's your map.
Right.
Yeah, that's your map.
Picture speaks 1,000 words.
And the picture speaks 1,000
Now
words.
tell me about Frank Sr. and Carmelita's their children, your aunts and uncles, and your dad.
Right, okay. They 4 children. The oldest was Hewlett Curry. She was a well-known musician, taught voice, piano, organ, directed choirs, and worked in gospel circles here for many years. That's the oldest. Dad was the second oldest, Frank Merriweather Jr.
Frank Merriweather Jr.
We're stressing, right?
Because so many people confuse.
That's right.
Frank Merriweather Jr. is the name attached to Frank Merriweather Library, which is next door.
Right. So Frank Merriweather Jr. And right under was Thyra Charles. She was one of the first black nurses here in the city. And the baby of the group is Judge Barbara Sims.
Judge Barbara Sims.
Yeah. And
she just transitioned just a couple of years ago.
Been 2 years ago. And she left a wonderful legacy in terms of the legal profession.
Yes.
Did a number of things as first black judge, first black woman to work in the DA's office, and did a lot of heavy lifting in that in the legal industry. Period.
Now, getting to your dad, was your dad the heir apparent to pick up the business?
Well, Dad had worked at. It's funny. The girls per se kind of went off into their own professions. Per se, as I said, my oldest aunt went into music, Thyra went into nursing, and Barbara went into, actually, a lot of folks don't know, she was a school teacher. Barbara Sims was a school teacher, and scored number 1 on the teacher's exam. I guess that was, we'd be back in the early 50s. Yeah, and taught school for a number of years, and then went into the legal profession. Yeah. But Dad always worked in the business there, and I'm thankful to the Lord that He chose my dad and my mother, Evelyn Patterson Ferguson, as a means for me and my 4 siblings to venture into this place called Earth.
Right.
I'm really thankful for them because they did a lot. They worked really hard, and they were good good parents to us. You know,
Right.
I often think about just life lessons that they passed along. And my mother was really able to come in. She's kind of quiet, but still works and still participates in the business. And she's really the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And I told her she's one of the top CEOs in all of Western New York. Still working, still doing her thing, but really came in and was a wonderful, wonderful helpmeet with my dad in terms of the second leg, per se, of the Criterion. Just was a fast learner, picked up a whole lot of different things, and was able really, to carry things on after Dad passed. Yeah.
Now, how big of it had to be a huge operation back in the day of photography and printing and putting out a paper.
Well, if you look back at a number of, because there were other newspapers here as well, but I think Dad revolutionized things in terms of the black press, in terms of putting in a photography and an engraving department.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing, and Pat, I only know, now there may be others, but I only know 2 families that produced their own product. And that was the Smitherman family, who had the Buffalo Star
Mm-hmm.
and the Buffalo Criterion. Now, the Smitherman family, they had a connection to the race riots in Oklahoma.
Okay.
Yeah, A.J. Smitherman
Okay.
was the editor and founder of the Star. And as I said, he had a few years ago, he was the Uncrowned Queens did some work in his death to get a warrant removed
Mm-hmm.
from him that went way back to the Oklahoma race riots.
Okay. The Tulsa,
The
Oklahoma.
Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots. So, but they produced their own paper,
Mm-hmm.
and we did too. But it was the difference is that we had put in an engraving department, which meant that you could now add pictures, and everything was produced in-house, per se. In other words, maybe 98% of the work that was done right inside our shop. We were actual, real newspaper publishers,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that we produced that product.
Mm.
Yeah, we produced that product. And there was even an issue back in the day, when Dad first decided to put this engraving department in, he just wasn't able to go out and get a press camera. There was some credentials, some other kind of things that he had to deal with, even in terms of law enforcement.
Right.
Yeah, what are you going to do? What pictures are you going to take? Who are you going to send them to?
Was there any pushback from any other communities on the production of a black press back then?
Well, I don't think back then. I think that I don't think Frank Merriweather Sr. maybe didn't have to necessarily deal with that.
Okay.
And I think that's because maybe the black community was small, and sometimes it's like in anything else. If a guy over across the street is doing well, Pat, and you're over here and you're a small organization, they're not necessarily so worried about you.
Right.
They just continue to work and you continue to work, and you don't. And then the other thing too is. There was an issue in terms of, again, telling our own story.
Right.
Yeah, without some of the sharp corners, per se, they were able to round off the edges. They knew the people that they were dealing with, and you got a more focused presentation per se of the happening or the event. Yeah. And then small population. Now I get emails from all over. Mm-hmm. Everybody is having something now, and I don't think that the Frank and Carmelita Merriweather necessarily had to deal with it at that point.
How did they learn this business?
Tuskegee College. Yeah, they were.
Tuskegee was integral in teaching.
Oh, absolutely.
Trades.
Trades, and Pat, more than one trade.
Yes.
More than one trade. As I said, my grandfather, I know he was a tailor. He had a degree in tailoring.
Okay.
Yeah, from that machine shop. We were on 367 William, and that facility, they needed to enlarge that place, and that was something that they were able to do themselves. Mm-hmm. Lay the brick, mix the mortar, run the irons. It's not like it is now, but they believed in real craftsmanship and putting out a real number one product.
Now let's talk about Frank Jr.
Frank Jr.
Picked up the mantle.
And
did your Aunt Barbara play any role of it, other than legal advice or?
Oh, absolutely. And Pat, if I can, I just want to step back to Frank Merriweather Sr., who went from the printing business into the newspaper business, which meant, in my eyes, that he went really to the next level.
Yes.
Because everything at the newspaper level is bigger, meaning the machinery is bigger, the process is bigger, what you're doing is bigger, because really to put out a weekly paper, it's an awful lot of work.
A lot of work.
And at that time, the process in which they were doing it, which was a letterpress process, was hard, heavy kind of work. We've for the most of, I'm not going to say most. Mm-hmm. All of our time in the newspaper business, we've put out a broadsheet paper, which not tabloid size, but we've always put out a broadsheet is a full sheet. Mm-hmm. Tabloid is usually half the size of a broadsheet paper. So we've always put out a broadsheet paper. And then just, Pat, if we take our phone, or any means, everything is always changing. It's changing every day. It's changing every day, man. So I went to charge my phone, and the young lady told me that her charger wouldn't fit mine because I don't even know what I had, Pat. I had something that her charger wouldn't fit mine. I think she said she had an LX7 or LX7.
Yeah, there's all different
sets.
So
Yeah.
It's constantly something.
Yeah, she said, Mr. Frank, you have an Android. So I said, okay, all right. So, but the technology has changed, and even back then, it was changing.
Let me ask you this: I knew he was active politically. Did he hold any appointments or offices?
Yeah, in fact, he was one of. I don't want to give you the right information, but he was one of the first blacks that worked in the New York State Assembly.
Yes.
As a clerk to Assemblyman, I think it was Barnard.
Mm-hmm.
He worked there, and he did a number of jobs in terms of. Probably the term, Pat, is appointments.
Okay.
That he had. I know he was in charge of the bathhouse on William Street, and maybe some other work. He worked in terms of dispensing news from the war into the black community as
Okay.
well, too, yeah. So that might have not been an official position, but access to the news so that the black community would be informed on that kind of work. Yeah.
Now, when did your dad begin moving into taking over?
Well, he had
the operation?
always had, it was a funny thing. He and my grandmother, the editorial part, Frank Merriweather Sr. took care of most of that. Now, Dad did too later on, but the day-to-day operation, that was my father and my grandmother
Okay.
on that, yeah.
You're listening to WDAP Radio.